I do have a lot of old magazines, vintage magazines, film magazines, computer magazines, and of course music magazines. And back in the day, I bought Keyboard magazine every time it came out. And when you buy a magazine over an extended period of time, there will be issues that you love more than others because they have articles and features that you find more interesting than others. So is this issue of February 1990. Okay, Keyboard Magazine, issue February 1990. Quite young Vince Clarke here, of Erasure. Tony Banks' solo statement. Tony Banks had come out with a new solo album at this point called Banks Statement, and it's an article about that. Again, jam-packed with nice things inside this issue here. Read this so many times. So let's see what we have here. No surprises on the first couple of pages. Korg, of course. The M3R. The M1 in a box, or at least half an M1. And that programmer here, did anyone of you have that one? I always looked at that image there and wished I had one. I didn't. Korg always had the last or the first couple of pages in Keyboard Magazine for many years. And the T series, an expansion on the M1. Of course, bigger, bolder, heavier, more expensive, weighted keys, etc. Ah, yes. Do you remember these pocket solutions from Anatech? I've made a video on one of these already. I think it was the pocket splits. Lets you split the keyboards into several different MIDI zones. And you can still get these on the secondhand market, of course, eBay, etc. And they are really useful for many different things. Very cool looking, the different color schemes, etc. Kawai still going strong in 1990 with its K series of synthesizers, very different synthesizers. Like the K3, for instance, had nothing to do with the K4 or the K1 before it. And many hail this, the Kawai Q80 sequencer as one of the best sequencers coming out of the 80s or early 90s. I have one of these in the video. I have one of these in the studio. I've never made a dedicated video about it, but it's a nice sequencer. And the letters, of course, this was pre-internet, so this was the form we had back then, so to speak, in paper form, where people could just write in complaints or praises for previous articles or, yeah, whatever they wanted to say really about things, this or that. And always nice to read this in hindsight, 35 years later. So much have changed, and yeah, very cool to write to read this now. Yamaha had their analog mixers, of course, as well as digital mixers at the time. I can't say I ever really used any of the analog keyboard mixers or line mixers from Yamaha during this period. The digital mixers were really started to coming on, and we were more interested in that actually. And what else? Next month in Keyboard Magazine, the film scoring issue. Maybe I'll go through that later. Alesis had the analog mixers at the time. And yeah, just a couple of pages later, we have ads from C-Lab, of course. And I used Notator a lot. I really loved it. I still use it occasionally. I made a couple of videos about it. And yeah, for a pattern-based sequencer, I really thought that was it at the time. Another very cool and useful section of Keyboard Magazine from the time, the questions page, where people could write in questions, either musically related questions or technical related questions. Everything from, hey, I'm a 70-year-old high school student and I play the piano as a hobby. I practice for an hour a day, but I'm not taking lessons. Could you give me some tips on how to practice? Very general question in a way and not easy to answer. And from that, which is purely music based, to trying to mod a Roland MPU 101 medium to voltage converter to drive a mini Moog, and you get some responses from the editorials here about what circuit you could build to make that happen. So that's two very different kinds of questions and answers. Really nice. What drives my interest mostly for this particular issue now, again in hindsight, is the question here. In the October issue of 1986, Keyboard Magazine, your clinic on programming the Roland JX10 states that the MKS70 permits MIDI controllers to alter any of its parameters. Neither your article nor the MKS70 manual explains how to do this. Please elaborate further. And this is, of course, well known now that you couldn't do that on the MKS70. But as the keyboard answers here, oops, at the time when the article was written, the author Erik Persing was working with a prototype MKS70 that did have this capability. For unknown reasons, the controller implementation was eliminated before the unit went into production, and that we all know that the MKS70 did not have that possibility or capability at that time. Now you can mod it to receive sysx data, etc., from a controller. And Erik Persing obviously had such a prototype at the time, but when it went into or came out, it didn't have that anymore, and we don't know why Roland omitted it from its software. Interesting. And other things as well. So all of these questions pages on previous Keyboard magazines are so interesting to read now, and I've picked up a lot of ideas and stuff to do from these pages. And this issue just gives and gives from the get-go. The reader's tips, another very cool page which we had back in the day, where people could send in tips for their gear, mostly different types of tips. And at the time, for me personally, the best tip here was effective memory allocation for the Roland U20. And back in the day, when you maybe had only a couple of pieces of gear, you really had to dig deep, learning them inside out, and just harnessing all the power you could from them. And as such, you often had to turn to pages like this to get ideas for things that you hadn't found out yourself. So this was a really nice page at the time. I made a video about this before, but in 1990, the Proteus was on everybody's lips. Everybody wanted this module because it gave you access to basically, or at least we thought so, everything from the big brothers, the emulators, and in terms of presets. But you could actually program this to a large degree as well. The Skinny Puppy. Octapad 2. First we zigged, then everybody zigged. Pad 8 Octapad from Roland. And the world view of different artists from around the world. Pay attention to East Germany here. We were not so far from the wall being torn down at this point. The 87th AAES convention in New York, and the manufacturers came out with new stuff. The SY77 from Yamaha, of course. Roland showing off their S770 sampler. Alesis MIDI Verb 3. yeah. Herbie Hancock scoring Harlem Nights. You remember that one? I never really liked that movie myself. I liked Eddie Murphy, of course. Never thought the movie was any good in particular. Passport made a lot of music software back then. Never used that myself, but I know a lot of artists used it. Aha, for instance, Master Tracks Pro. And here, of course, the main article, Vince Clarke, a decade after Depeche Mode, 8 years after Yazoo, Erasure expands into new techno territory on Wild. So let's see what's going on here. He's playing a Roland here, of course. You all know what Roland is playing here. It's the D50, of course. And well. Here's his live rack for that Wild tour. Let's go through that first. Without reading this one, can we pick out what's in the racks here? Akai S1000, Matrix 6R. Can't really see it here from where I'm standing reading this issue with you. I have to move closer, but then I will be obstructing the camera lens here. The MKS80, a Roland A880, I think. Some DI boxes, a Roland line mixture. We have another MKS80, the M1R, the Prophet VS rack, and the D550, and that's a Casio. More DI boxes, I assume. Let's see if I got this right. Clarke with the Erasure Stage Rack System, Akai S1000, Obra Matrix 6R, Roland MKS 50, which I didn't see. Custom Erasure MIDI Gate System, yeah, Roland Super Jupiter, that's the MKS 80. A DAT recorder, Roland A660, Roland A110. That's what I meant by seeing those the keyboard layout in the LED lights here. So MIDI switches, direct boxes, Roland M16E, yeah, line mixer, Roland MKS 80, Korg M1R, sequential Prophet D50, Casio VZ1M, yeah, and 4 direct boxes. Interestingly, they separate between the two racks when it comes to the MKS 80. Here they call it the Roland Super Jupiter, and here they call it the MKS 80. It's the same thing, of course. So that's pretty cool racks for the time. Should do it. Clarke used a lot of the Prophet VS on the Circus, which I assume they did some tracks from that as well during their live gig on the Wild tour, I think. So it's a nice interview with the Clarke here, and he talks about the process of Wild and how they started to write together. He and Andy Bell. And usually before he wrote the backing tracks alone, and Andy came in and did some things with the melody lines, etc. Now they're writing together, which he thinks is a good thing to do at the time. And interestingly, he is in a good mood. And here's more about the gear setup, and is using. No, this time out, Clarke will leave his trusty BBC microcomputer and the UMI sequencing software at home, and he's using a MC500 for the tour instead. And he's using a R8 and TR505 drum machine on the tour as well. On the last tour, we used a sampler for the drums. It was fine, but I like drum machines. They seem a little more solid to me than anything else. They can drop off the stage and will still work. I can relate to that, absolutely. In the past, Clarke used his master keyboard to control stage lighting by converting MIDI data to contact closures for tripping light switches. But his he became frustrated with that, so he wanted more than that for that tour, for this new tour. Nice, nice. And more about his passion for older analog synthesizers, etc., etc. And he talks about how he's going over to, buying things at thrift stores, etc. You could do that back then, I guess. I did myself. He mentioned the Oberheim Expander as his favorite synth. And nice. The SY77 again. And the more Vince Clarke is going at about CV to MIDI or MIDI to CV converters and stuff like that. Like I've said before, if you want scans of any of these things, please send me an email. I won't do it for free, but I might scan this for you if you're interested. MIDI Verb 3, of course, new at this time. And these are really, really great. The sound pages, the vinyl stuck to this spine here. I won't break this free to play it for you, but we had a lot of cool sound pages in Keyboard Magazine at this time. Jean-Michel Jarre, among other artists, had sound pages like this on here. So very cool stuff. The Digitech multi-effects processor. Never used that in particular myself. If you have, please say so in the comment section. And another series of features that were common at around this time in Keyboard Magazine were those keyboard clinics where you had some expert on a piece of gear going into great details to show us and tutor us on how to program it or use it, or tips and tricks, etc. And in this case, the Kurzweil K1000, which I have a video on my channel from before. And this sounds very good even today. It's probably one of my favorite bread and butter modules ever made. Very, very good sound quality coming out of that even today. And if you're interested in this module, this clinic is definitely something you should read, which I shall not go into detail on here. But those clinics are great. I remember Eric Persing had one for the D50 and the JX8P, and I've even done on a clinic, gone through a clinic of the Sequential Prophet 2000, and you should really check those out. The Alesis at the time, the MMT8 sequencer and the HR16 drum machines. Here we have the two different versions of the HR16. The standard one and the black one, the B16B. Great drum machines. Still have the HR16. The VFX SD from Ensoniq. Steinberg Jones, Cubase, of course. What else? That's a long clinic. Tascam. Although not related to synth pop or pop music, which I always did, and yeah, that's my passion really. This is about jazz, but the title here, When Does a Trend Become a Trap? Very relatable to other genres as well. I think, if I remember correctly, that this article and some of the statements here from some of the guys really had those letters coming in later with a lot of people upset by some of the things said in this article by some of these artists, referring to other artists, etc. So The MIDI tap. Lone Wolf. Can't say I've ever... I can't remember this ad. And I definitely can't remember this module. What does it even do? Is it a effects processor? I could have Googled it for you prior to this video, but I have no idea what this does. So please tell us in the comment section if you have any intel on this one. I'd love to hear it. And yeah, expansion cards and libraries, etc. for different synths started to come on more and more during the late 80s and early 90s. The M1, the D50, etc. To synths that were really made for third parties to make sounds for and sell. More kawais. And here you get to hear perfect pitch or learn perfect pitch. This ad, yeah, we've seen this in other issues as well. And what else? Yeah, you could always win stuff in Keyboard Magazine. This time a Kawai Grand and the K4. And here is the other great article of this issue. This with Tony Banks. And all of you know, of course, who Tony Banks is. The keyboard player of Genesis with his EMU Emulator 3 here. And Genesis is, of course, one of the all-time great bands. But I always had a thing for the solo things that Tony Banks did. I always liked the way he voiced his chords on his music for Genesis or as himself, and the textures in his sounds and how he did things. And so to read this interview coming up here, this article, remember, this was way before the internet, so we had no other way of getting intel on anything except magazines like this. So I read this with great interest. And one of the things that interested me at the time was his approach to playing and stuff like that. And one of the first things that I laid my eyes on here is this. The idea of doing solos never even occurred to me. I was thinking in terms of the writing, which is why I didn't improvise. I never claimed to be a great improviser. I can improvise well amongst the group because it doesn't matter if I play a few bum notes. And I always was like that. I never liked to improvise. I always liked to rehearse and learn things. If I was going to play live, I always liked to rehearse beforehand, so I never had to improvise. And having someone like him saying basically how I felt at the time was kind of liberating to me. Well, here's this famous guy thinking the same as I was my thought process at the time, and it sort of liberated me from the pressure of having to do solos and improvise within the different musical groups I was involved with at the time. But enough of that, back to Tony Banks here and Banks' Statement, which was the album previously released when this interview was conducted, and he's talking about that. And again, I can scan this for you if you want to read it. Send me an email for that. And let's move on, because there's a lot of text here and I can't really read out everything in this interview. So let's go on. What sequencer did you use on Bank Statement? He's using the Steinberg Pro 24. Which was very common at the time. He's starting to look into Cubase, he says, but for now he's using the Steinberg Pro 24. And he says he likes to have things quantized as well as a more loose feel. Are any of the piano sounds on the record made by a real piano? Most of it is the Yamaha CP70, and there's quite a lot of Roland MKS 20, which he seems to like a lot. And he's chopping up a lot of samples on the emulators for you to use in this on the record. The Kurtz file, PX, we had the clinic on it previously. he's been interviewed a lot in the recent years in Keyboard Magazine. The Rhythm Abacus, programming drums Roland style. Again, a great little thing on how to program TR style on the Rolands, like the 707 and 727. All those grid-based, pattern-based drum machines. Often a great way of getting inspiration going. The Art pitch transposer. At this time, there were coming more and more vocal effect processors on the market. Prior to auto-tune, you could change and alter your vocal sound quite drastically with gear. The Emax 2, always prefer that to the original Emax. I really like the machine industrial sound of the Emax 2, even though I never made or make industrial type of synth music. Tactics for writing tunes. Around this time in the 90s and early 90s, yeah, all through the 90s really, I did a lot of live playing. Wedding receptions, funerals. I was hired as a musical director for many different things, venues, etc. And so musical theory and playing and rehearsing and just playing was a big part of my life at that point. So everything I could get my hands on in terms of learning stuff to change things up was always interesting to me. So these articles like this, often very, very interesting, and I learned a lot from it. Brother made sequencers at the time. Who'd imagine? I just recently was on a forum where people were asking about the Brother sequencer, and here's an ad for it. Don Henley seems like he's embracing new technology at the time. He sure doesn't do that now. Now he's pretty anti-new tech, it seems. But back then he was an endorser for Akai, apparently. I guess he used the Akais for drum samples, which he played on a MIDI kit, drum kit, maybe. But Don Henley used a lot of Lindrums in his records. Boys of the Summer is a good example of the Lindrum that he used. Octave tricks, very nice. Something about a MIDI guitar, alternate controllers. The quadroverb, not only the MIDI verb, but the quadroverb from Alesis out at this point. And patches, of course. In this issue, there's no synth patches, but the page with patches you could program yourself on various synths. Always very interesting. I have a lot of these patches made for different synths. This time it's for effects processors. The Roland DP5 and the Lexicon LXP1 and the Yamaha Rev 5. Mark of the Unicorn. The U20 again, sound design, LFO effects, always very interesting. That you could do a lot with LFOs. Songwriting, this was gold, Jerry Gold at the time. Although this is quite rudimentary, sort of. It meant a lot to people trying to learn things about harmonics and stuff like that. MIDI implementation started coming on more and more in the mid to late 80s, early 90s. Again, this is a really nice issue with a lot of things to learn. Improvisational piano, like I said earlier, I didn't like to improvise as much, so actually these articles didn't do it for me, to put it like that, because again, I didn't like to improvise, but a rehearsed improvisation is something else. It will sound to the audience like you're improvising, but it's really something you rehearsed beforehand, so you know exactly what you're going to play. But to have it sound like an improvisation, that's something else, and in that case, it could be great fun to learn. Again, this is something I've embraced from early on. Sometimes it's good to get away from all the technology and concentrate on the fundamentals of songwriting. Many successful writers prefer to work out their ideas simply, either at the piano or with a synth and a drum machine, or guitar for that matter. This is from Jeff Lorber. I embrace this to this day. Most of my music has been done on a piano first. I've fleshed out the chords and melody and structure, etc., the different parts, before I start going onto the computer and arranging stuff. And vintage synths. The Prophet 5, considered vintage in 1990. That's interesting in itself. And current price used $200. Admittedly, up to $1,500. So, but in 1990, and maybe even so more a couple of years later, most analog synths, including the Yamaha CS80 and stuff like that, could almost be had for nothing. And yeah, it's crazy to think about now. So a nice article on that. Again, reading a chord chart. The ability to read a chord chart quickly was very important back in the day if you were hired again as a musical director or for live gigs of various kinds. So again, articles like this, very, very useful for us back then. Remember, we had no internet. I might do a video on this later, but the ability to read chord charts on the fly was something I trained a lot for back in the day. I could be hired as a musical director on a gig, and 5 minutes before we'd go on stage, someone would hand me a piece of paper with chords on it and ask me, "Hey Espen, could we play that as an encore?" And I didn't have time to study it very carefully, of course, in those situations. So the ability to have trained for and being able to read chords on the fly would come in handy. So again, articles like this in old keyboard magazines, so useful at the time. So it wasn't always about gear, it was about playing and doing stuff like that. That really I liked about Keyboard Magazine, a mix of tech and human emotions and playability, stuff like that. Review of the Korg T1, sampling playing synthesizer or sample playing synthesizer. The verdict from Keyboard Magazine, pros, 88-note weighted action keyboard, wide variety of sounds, etc. Cons, user samples can only be mapped to drum kits. Well, I never had it, so I can't really comment on it. I had more dedicated samplers for doing sampling. Of course, cassette tape-based multi-track recorders were still a big thing in 1990, of course, prior to ADAT and the digital tape machine systems that came a few years later. What else? If you're serious about playing, you're ready for the DPM3 from Peavey. Well, that's up for debate, I guess. Manny's music. Many of these smaller ads like this we've seen in numerous what was in it videos before. Magnetic Music Prism, IBM PC sequencing software. Never tried it, never saw it. Again, if any of you used that, please let us know in the comment section. Have you liked it? Maybe you're still using it in some capacity. Caruso music. And here we have it, Dr. T's Tiger sequencing editing software for the Atari. Never used that. thoroughbred music. I've asked this before and I've gotten answers. Can't remember them right now, but I assume some of these or many of these no longer exists. Music stores like that. Leslie simulators. Grandma's Music and Sound. 12-tone system Cakewalk Professional 3.0. Again, IBM PC sequencer. Pay attention to how many software sequencers were coming out at around this point. Great time to actually make music on your computer because you had so many options compared to what was mostly hardware sequencers up to this point. Of course, you had both the Atari and the Amiga in the mid-80s as well, not denying that. But now things are really exploding in terms of software for music making. And coming towards the end here, the Apex systems, the Orl Exciters, and finally the spec sheet where we have some small, not ads, but yeah, information about things coming out. Among them, the Waldorf microwave. I had that one. That's a cool little keyboard stand there. And the classifieds, and let's see if we have something cool here. Sounds and software. Yeah, lots of discs and sounds and patches, etc. for various synths. Sequences, of course. People were selling sequences for famous songs, etc. Very important for the live gigging musicians to have easy access to famous songs for their sequencers of choice and saving some time. The Atari Stacy, always wanted it, could never afford it, never used it. It looks cool still. Lyric now, of course, with this Atari software and some MIDI guitar synth here. Cool. And Yamaha. And that's Keyboard Magazine, issue 1990, February. Great issue. So many things to read here. So this is definitely one of the issues I read more than others because it had a lot of things I was interested in at the time. Hope you enjoyed this video. I'm Espen Kraft and I'll see you next time. Cheers.